All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm super happy to have you all here. We are starting off with our speaker, Armin Ansari. Armin is the director of the Center for Science and Technology at the EPA Office of Radiation and Indoor Air, the Radiation Protection Division. Prior to joining the EPA in 2023, he was the Radiological Assessment Team Lead at the CDC and in Atlanta. He received his BS and PhD degrees in radiation biophysics from the University of Kansas and conducted his postdoc research in radiation-induced mutagenesis at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. He is a fellow and president emeritus of the Health Physics Society and the current president of the American Academy of Health Physics. He's also an elected member of the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements and serves on the U.S. scientific delegation to the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. So that's just a laundry list of his incredible accomplishments, and it was a mouthful even for me, and I talk a lot. Armin is here today, and we were super excited to have him here to present an update from the US EPA Radiation Protection Program. Armin, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Bridget, Brianna, for having me join your chapter meeting. Full disclosure, I'm not in my office. That background is to fool people that I actually work in my office, but that's I'm at home right now, and it is Eastern time zone. So I have a really good excuse. If I sound incoherent at times, I'd have the best excuse. But really, I saw an article that you've written for, was it the HP News, I think, that talked about your chapter starting up, which was really good. And kudos to all of you who get the chapter going. And just so you know, a Baltimore, Washington chapter that I joined when I moved to DC has always been one of the larger chapters. You know, there are so many health physicists here from federal agencies and other organizations, and always really good meetings, well attended. And we've been having problems too. So part of it, I think, is actually post-COVID. It seems that more difficult to get people. So we do have hybrid and virtual events too, but I just wanted to share that it's not is the size of the chapter is actually, I think, part of the times that it's difficult to have this, but the wonderful thing that you're doing. So as Brianna said, I recently joined EPA last year, last January. I came from CDC, and of course, both agencies are public health agencies, but they work under different authorities, and their work portfolios are very different. So even though they're both public health agencies, so I had some learning curve to do, you know, and then actually get accustomed to the mission of the program and what we need to do and so forth. So it's been a learning experience for me too, and it's been a very enjoyable experience. I really enjoy the people we have and the program and the philosophy and such. So what I thought I'd share with you, and I'm going to share the screen here in a second. Put it on there. I assume it's showing okay now. So I thought I'd basically share with you a little bit of background about EPA Radiation Protection Program, and then go over some of the projects that at least my group in the Center for Science and Technology is involved, and a few other things that are going on, and things that, you know, we're thinking about doing in near future, or at least things that we're thinking about doing that I hope would be useful. One thing just to say the history of EPA. EPA was created in 1970. It was a planned reorganization of the executive branch. Was when President Nixon was in office. So the origin goes back to then. And there was a lot of growing environmental concerns in the US, and the agency was created, and a number of functions that other departments of the executive branch used to do was transferred to the new organization that was EPA. For some functions were transferred from Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now, this doesn't exist anymore. This was the predecessor to Health and Human Services. And some functions from Agriculture and mainly from Atomic Energy Commission, which still existed in 1970. And then Federal Radiation Council. And I'll talk to you about that, what it was. It was predecessor to the EPA radiation program. So the functions were transferred to EPA. And one thing that I wanted to share, it was about, I think, a month ago or 2 months ago, PBS Frontline had a documentary that they aired on Love Canal. And this is really educational. If you look it up, it is on the web, free to watch. And it's amazing from so many aspects. That was, I mean, many of you have heard Love Canal, may not know the background and what was involved. But I think if your interest in any way deals with environmental health, you kind of need to watch that because first of all, it speaks to you how far we have come in a good way from how things were in the 1970s. And it was so just eye-opening to watch that. The concerns of citizens and the issues involved. Of course, this was all chemicals. There was no radioactivity there. But I can't think of anything that didn't have relevance to issues that deal with radioactivity and radiation. So many of the issues, environmental waste, communication, risk communication, concerns of citizens, and the concerns they have, and their hunger for information and reassurance. All of that stuff really is relevant to radiation issues and the kind of issues that we as health physicists need to address and deal with. So I really highly recommend watching that documentary. So EPA has a responsibility and authorities to establish generally applicable environmental standards for the protection of the general environment from radioactive material. And the bullets that you see there: collect, analyze, interpret data, develop protective action guides. This one, for example, came from the predecessor to Health and Human Services, but it was transferred to EPA. Conduct environmental impact analysis and evaluate them, and issue federal guidance. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The purpose of this was to, in the blue box, to advise the president with respect to, to advise the president. Let's do in here, let's go back up here. Sorry about that. Advise the president with respect to radiation matters directly or indirectly affecting health, including guidance for all federal agencies in the formulation of radiation standards and in the establishment and execution of programs in cooperation with the states. At that time, that really didn't exist. Remember that at that time, we did not have NRC yet, for example. And there was really this responsibility had to rest with some federal entity, which at that time was Federal Radiation Council. And we had NCRP, for example, at that time. We had ICRP, we had other organizations, but a single federal agency to advise the president on these matters didn't exist. And that was the genesis of the Federal Radiation Council that was created in 1960. And at that time, the Federal Radiation Council, which now then became EPA radiation program, it was instructed to consult with National Academy of Sciences, the NCRP. Those are named actually in the instruction. Those organizations are named specifically. So EPA is instructed to consult with academies, with the NCRP, and with qualified scientists and experts in the field of biology, medicine, and health physics, essentially to formulate its guidance. And we do that pretty consistently. And to give you an example of this last bit is one example of this one, because that's kind of general statement. Just 2 weeks ago, we had our draft Federal Guidance Report 16, which I'll tell you about in a minute, which has the cancer risk coefficients being presented for review to a panel of experts that are part of the EPA Science Advisory Board. We haven't, we didn't select the panel. It was an extremely, really distinguished panel of experts. They're independent from EPA, and they take a critical look at the draft document, and they're reviewing it now, and they'll give us their recommendations. So that's part of sort of how we take advantage of the expertise that exists out there outside of these organizations to get advice in formulating any kind of guidance that the agency produces. The early years of the 1960s, and this is something I really didn't know much about before joining EPA, of the history of Federal Radiation Council in the 10 years before EPA was created. And there's a good bit of documents early on in that decade. Paul Tompkins was executive director of the Federal Radiation Council, and he had published some papers which are illuminating in terms of what was going on, what were the concerns, and how was the sort of approach and philosophy to radiation protection. And it comes out of those pages. You get a feel of what were the issues that they were talking about. And some of the early federal guidance reports that came out, as you can imagine, dealt with concerns about nuclear fallout, because of course, we didn't have the Test Ban Treaty till 1963. So at that time, the concerns for nuclear fallout was very real. And it was on top of the concerns for the radiation protection community. But these are historical documents that I think are educational, because I think in a lot of times when we evaluate what we're doing now, it's really good to keep in mind and be aware of where we came from, what were the concerns, and how that sort of put that in context of the kind of issues we deal with today. Now, so this is today. This is the radiation protection program today. And we have, I think as Brianna mentioned in the intro, we're housed in the Office of Radiation and Indoor Air at EPA. And we have 4 divisions. We have the Radiation Protection Division, and I'm here in the Center for Science and Technology. We have a Center for Rad Emergency Management, and Ken Yale, if you work with him, chair of the advisory team, he is director of that center. Radiation Information and Outreach, Shelley Liver is the director of that, and Jessica Weider, if you worked with Jessica before, she used to be here before we lost her to FEMA. And then Tom Peake is the director of Center for Waste Management and Regulation. That's essentially the headquarters staff for Radiation Protection Program, and we were in DC. Then another sister division we have also in DC is the Indoor Environment Division. They deal with asthma, and air quality and such. And the overlap with the 2 divisions is the radon program, where they administer the radon grants, but we support them with the science for that radon. And then they have 2 other pieces of the organization. One is the NARAL. You may have heard about this. This is the National Analytical Radiation Laboratory in Montgomery, Alabama. This is a world-class laboratory, and I know that it's very difficult to have HPS meetings in Montgomery, Alabama, because just getting there is not necessarily convenient. It's not a hub. But if we ever did have a Health Physics Society meeting there, that would be such a great technical tour. And the staff there are extremely happy to give tours to people to come and see. It's a national resource that we have, and it's a wonderful facility. And the other center that we have is the National Center for Radiation Field Operations. That's in Las Vegas, and they do work on radiation, the emergency response and radiation preparedness, and so forth. We have also regions as well. EPA has 10 regions, and a lot of the work that EPA does in supporting the states, that comes out of our 10 regions. And the headquarters staff support the regions as necessary or when a situation arises. In our division, I wanted to show you this. This is not talks about radiation protection division and our 4 centers. And I want to share with you that when I interviewed for this position, one of the questions I had was I wanted to find out how siloed the organization is. In other words, because for many years, I did emergency preparedness. And if any of you is engaged in nuclear emergency preparedness, you know that it never leave you. You kind of develop the gene for it or the passion for it. And so I didn't want to leave that entirely. And also, I have interest in communication and other things. But what they shared with me, and it turned out to be very true, is that it's a lot of collaboration between our groups, and it's a very nice environment. So it's not siloed at all, and we work together on many of the issues. Of course, each center takes the lead as appropriate, but we all support each other, and we can help on any of those issues that comes up. So that I really enjoy having that environment. Some of the authorities that the EPA works under, the Clean Air Act and the NESHAPs, which is under Clean Air Act. So if you have any, under the Clean Air Act, radioactive materials are basically are covered there. And if you ever worked the code CAP 88, I know I used, when I was a consultant in, was it early 90s, I used CAP 88 to do stuff for a client. But that's mainly the tool, the computer code that you use to show compliance with RAD NESHAPs. So that's one. And of course, we have the Safe Drinking Water Act, and CERCLA or Superfund program is a huge program that's administered under a different office. But we collaborate with them in some issues, technical issues that overlaps between the two programs. And then Uranium Mill Tailings, Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and these are the 40 CFR, the regulations that cover those things. And the WIP, EPA provides oversight for WIP operations. And we have our Center for Waste Management and Regulations is involved in this very closely. And we have also regulations that cover the Yucca Mountain that I put in here because those are moot right now. Then the one thing I wanted to sort of single out specifically is the 40 CFR 190, which regulates or provides the standards for nuclear power operations. And this 40 CFR 190, the reason I mention it is that there's a lot of calls for EPA to update this because it is, quite frankly, dated. And we realize that it's dated. Stakeholders realize that it's dated. And the program is ready to work on the update when, of course, we're given the instructions to do it. We can't just update it because we want to. But when the call comes for us to do it, we're certainly ready to do that and work on it. 40 CFR 190 establishes off-site public dose limits from nuclear power operations and also sets the release limits for selected radionuclides. It limits how many curies of certain radioactive material can be released into the environment per gigawatt year of electrical energy. That may sound kind of strange, but if you think that back in when this rule was written or was first drafted, we still didn't have NRC. NRC didn't begin operations till January of 1975. And also, this bullet is kind of an eye-opener. In 1970, when EPA was created, we had 17 nuclear power plants were in operation. 49 were under construction, additional 48 were in planning stage. And in the documents, the technical basis documents that sort of lay the foundation for writing for the CFR 190, they were projecting at that time that by the year 2000, we would have 1,000 nuclear reactors. and we would have 25 reprocessing plants. So that obviously didn't pan out. That didn't happen. But at the time, this was the thought process, and so some of this limits on radionuclide that was based on how many gigawatt year of energy are you producing. Based on that, this many amount of radioactive material you can sort of put out of your stack and into the environment. That's where that sort of came from, and also placing those limits for the public from that. At that time, the limits that were placed here was based on ICRP2. So that sort of tells you how dated the document is. And let me see. Okay. We're going back and put it in. Okay. Now, Federal Guidance Report, it's just a timeline of the various FGRs that were published. The most recent one was Federal Guidance 15. Many of you may have used Federal Guidance Reports 11, 12, and 13 in your day-to-day work. I know I've used them a lot, especially when I was a consultant. So FGR 15 updated FGR 12, that was the external dose coefficients. And the one we're working on now that I mentioned is being reviewed by our Science Advisory Board is FGR 16, which is the update of 13. And this is the cancer risk coefficients for environmental exposures. And so it's a major update to Federal Guidance 13. It increased the number of radionuclides. We have a lot of new science that were developed in the interim when FGR 13 was printed. We have new biokinetic models, dosimetric models. Obviously, U.S. population demographic data had to be updated, and cancer risk models had a major revamp based on the new data and the new report by the national academies and such. So there was a lot of new science that had to be incorporated into this document. So FGR 13 really needed a major update, and that's what that is, FGR 16. The graph you see is parts of the, I'm going to show you that we're also analyzing, comparing FGR 16 and 13 data and make sure that for radionuclides that have major change, we know exactly the reason for them. So that's part of the analysis for that that's coming along. And this it's just to show how many different publications and new documents are feeding into development of FGR 16. Of course, nuclear decay data updated, biokinetic data. This is a huge effort, and feeding into this module, the biokinetic module. And the specific absorption fractions, essentially when you have intake of radioactive material in your body, how much of the activity you have in one organ irradiates that organ or neighboring organs and such. So that data that comes into play, and of course the cancer risk models. The EPA Blue Book was updated first. That was a few years ago. And then that fit into the FGR 16. And this, the cancer risk, of course, we're using the cancer statistics from the US population, and we're using the census data for the 2014-16 US population. That's to base the cancer risk models based on that. And exposure factors, of course, are US exposure factors. So this is a US population specific cancer risk coefficients, the best that we can do with the science of today. That's essentially the purpose of the document. Before coming to EPA, I didn't know why it took so long to produce these documents. I really didn't have any appreciation for it, but I certainly do now. It's a very involved process that when you first conceive of developing a federal guidance and then what you have to do to develop it, and then to have all the reviews. And for this update to FGR 16, we're in this right now. We're in the process of external review, and that has multiple steps involved in it. But here where we are, and we hope to finalize edits this year and send it to publication. But the actual publication, when it's available, it will probably be early next year, not this year. And again, this is a chart that wants to communicate how we use science to inform policymaking at EPA. You have the research that's been done, basic research and analysis that's been peer-reviewed in publications, scientific journals, and such. Then these research papers get synthesized by organizations like the National Academies or UNSCARE, and then organizations like ICRP and NCRP use those consensus documents to produce sort of recommendations and standards. And then that informs kind of the guidance and policy that we would produce. So it goes sort of through this cycle. And in the recent issue of Health Physics Journal, it was a special issue that Mike Mahaffey edited, and we were invited to contribute to that. So there is an article that we wrote, Science-Informed Policymaking for Protecting People and the Environment from Radiation, and in that issue. So if you're interested, you can, this is not a very long paper, maybe 5-6 pages, but it kind of describes this process in essence, and some of the fundamental principles that are the foundation of those policy and guidance documents for EPA. Now I want to change gears a little bit and share this with you, that this is a quotation that says, "Today we know about all we need to know to adequately protect ourselves from ionizing radiation." And just think about that for a second and see, do you agree with that statement? That today we know all we need to know to adequately protect ourselves from ionizing radiation. This is something that Lord Taylor had said in 1980. Of course, he's a very well-respected kind of the father of our field in many ways. And in 1980, that's sort of when he was giving the Siebert Award lecture at the ERPA meeting, in the fifth ERPA meeting. This is what he said, and you can think about that whether you agree with that or not. But and this chart, I really like this chart. I kind of adopted this from a chart that was in an UNSCARE document. And I use this, and if you find it useful, you're welcome to use it, either the version that's in this document, the UNEP UNSCARE document, or this version you're welcome to use. I use this to communicate when we want to talk about the radiation risk, just as a sort of to begin the conversation, that it is a schematic chart. In other words, it's not to scale. Here we have radiation dose. It's more like close to a log scale. And then here we plot probability of adverse health effects. So probability of having health effects as a function of dose. And starting from this end, a very high dose, there's no question. We know a lot about what happens here, what clinical signs and symptoms there are in individuals. So the clinical representation of course, you have individual variability, but we understand this really well, and we know what happens here. As we move down the dose and we come to dose ranges here and below, because that's where we start to see clinical signs and symptoms or acute radiation syndrome, it starts about this dose and higher. And of course, here the reason the probability is 100% because you die. I mean, the dose gets high enough, probability of death is 100%. That's what that is. As we come down, the health effects changes. We're no longer getting acute radiation syndrome. There's really no clinical signs and symptoms here. And although you could do a blood test and figure out that the person was irradiated, but there is no clinical representation that you can tell. Fatality is zero almost, but what we worry about is basically cancer. And we have good evidence, good epidemiologic evidence in populations that these doses do increase the risk of cancer in populations at these doses. And then, of course, that probability decreases when with decreasing dose. And then when we come doses below 100 millisieverts, that gets really tough because now we have increased uncertainty and statistical limits of investigation really is a challenge. And all of our environmental exposures that we worry about, occupational, it's short of an accident, something really disastrous happening where you have people being exposed to doses here or doses here. Most everything we deal with, even medical procedures, and even in an accident, if we have people, say the worst accident is a nuclear detonation, we have people that get exposed to very high doses, but we also have very large population that get exposed to doses at this level. And it's here that really is a challenge for us because it's biologically plausible, but really something that we cannot really show epidemiologically. And the reason I like to put it in this chart is to show the actual probability. We're talking about very low probability events here. So the question is, what is the probability of having adverse effect? Is it low? Is it really low? Or is it really, really, really low? But it is low in all of those cases. And that's something that we shouldn't lose sight of, that we're talking about very low probabilities of health effects at these levels. But that's a challenge, and that's what we have to deal with. And that's the region where we're trying to protect and administer programs of radiation protection. And of course, we have a lot of uncertainty, as you could imagine, many questions to ask. And that's why there is so much going on, so much you've heard about low-dose radiation effects, low-dose radiation research, and such. And there's a lot of publications, a lot of guidance that comes from that. Most recently, the National Academies had a report that DOE funded. It was leveraging advances in modern science to revitalize low-dose radiation research in the United States. And the National Academies said that we need to have significant investment over a sustained period spanning several decades to develop and maintain a multidisciplinary low-dose radiation research program. And what they recommended, that it takes $100 million a year for the first 10 or 15 years. And you can imagine that it is almost impossible to secure that kind of funding to institute such a research program for low-dose research over several decades. But that's what the scientist says we need. And the chair of that committee, and there was a sort of a fact sheet or some press release that came, and this is a quotation from Dr. Gray, who did an admirable job of putting this document together with the experts panelists. This is a quote from him, that there is much we don't know about the impacts of low-dose radiation exposures on our health, but recent advances in research, new tools, and a coordinated multidisciplinary research program could help us fill those gaps. So there is much we don't know about the impacts of low-dose radiation. And I want you to compare that now to the quote from Laurie Taylor, who said it about 40 years ago, that we know all we need to know to adequately protect ourselves from ionizing radiation. So which one of these statements actually is true? And the way I think about it is that both are really true because they're coming from a different perspective. Are you looking at it from a scientific point of view? Science really never ends, because when you do good science, you answer one question and that answer would generate multiple more questions. So the process of scientific inquiry actually never ends. There are things we're questioning today or we want to learn about today that we didn't even know it existed 20, 30 years ago. So that's a never-ending endeavor, in other words. But if we're concerned about protecting people and the environment, I think we do a fairly good job of doing that, and the track record is really good. So both of those statements are actually true. And there's a thing, as a concept. I was recently reading this document just last weekend. That's why I wanted to use this quote, but this has been said in other places too. A distinction should be drawn between the use of scientific information to construct a workable and acceptable protection system and the provision of scientific estimates of dose and risk to individuals and specific population groups. So those are two different things. They're related, but two different things, and that we should keep in mind. The other thing, I said, by the way, I don't know if there's some change going on in the next few years. And for those of us who are a little bit older like me, it's not going to impact our work much. We'll be retired way before any change happens. But for those of you who are younger, you probably have to deal with this. ICRP is going to discontinue use of equivalent dose for setting limits for like lens of the eye and skin and extremities, because the argument is that radiation rating factor that's used is for stochastic effects. So they get in red, not the concept of equivalent dose, but the idea of setting limits based on equivalent dose. And they want to use just absorbed dose. So that change is coming. Whether we would adopt it or when we would adopt it in the US is something that those of you who are younger need to deal with, not us. But that discussion is being had right now. And there was a report, ICRU 95, that came. It's kind of a co-publication with ICRP. And that's something that I just wanted to highlight. And also just a personal opinion, that I think we as a community of radiation protection specialists have made the field of radiation protection perhaps more complicated than it needs to be. I think things can be done in a more simple way than we do it. And we've made it so complicated that's even hard to explain and communicate among ourselves, let alone communicating the concepts to people outside of our field. That was just a personal commentary, my own opinion. So for low-dose research, this is, again, a perspective that I want to share. If we look at it from a public health perspective, what is the objective of low-dose research? Is to inform policies and practices for radiation protection of the public. That includes sensitive, vulnerable populations, workers, and patients. And if we applied a process similar to EPA's data quality objectives, and I don't know whether you've used that before in your work or not, it's a process that is very systematic and says if you want to collect data, you have to first ask, what is the question you're asking? Okay, first of all, what is the problem you're trying to address? What is the question you're trying to answer? What kind of data do you need to answer your question? And then if you want to do research or you want to collect data, are these data the type of data that could help you answer the question? Or if this research that you're doing has the potential to generate data that could actually answer the original question you had. And I think if you applied that principle to low-dose research, we might do better as a community. So not always just go for something that's interesting or something that, it should be more directed, more organized. And I think part of that came out from the national academies, although perhaps not stated so directly. But that's sort of, again, another commentary, just from looking at it from a public health perspective, not necessarily from a research scientist perspective. I'm going to wrap up pretty soon because I know the time is closing. But a couple of things that I wanted to share we're thinking about is the concept of reference individual. In the 1950s, we were concerned about adult workers because that's what the concern was, how to protect adult male workers because there are not many females at that point in the workforce. So reference man was actually literally kind of a man. It was based on adult male worker. But the science had advanced, our knowledge had advanced. We know that age at time of exposure, gender make a difference. We have now computational phantoms. We have reference individuals and that are age-based and gender-based for adults that we use. But we still do have certain approximations that we make. For example, when we use tissue weighting factors, that's standard. We don't have different tissue weighting factors for different genders and such. And we also really don't have a way to take into account immunological, genetic, or environmental physiological differences in different populations, or certainly not individuals, into our calculations. Genetic predisposition, epigenetics is a huge field, and that really hasn't entered into the concept of how you do risk estimates. So those are the things we don't know, but we have come a long, long way from 1950s. So there's a really good part to this story, but we also have to be cognizant that a lot of things we do are still averages, approximations, and we're far from a point where we can look at an individual and say anything intelligible about their individual risk from a particular exposure. There's a lot of uncertainty in that. I'll skip this because I think you all realize radiation communication is such an important aspect of our work as radiation protection professionals. And we do have a robust program at EPA that I really enjoy working with. Another product we're using is second edition of MARSOM, the Multi-Agency Radiation Survey and Site Investigation Manual. If you've used MARSOM in your work, so you can look forward to seeing this version 2 is a huge update to the original because it incorporates new ways and new survey methods, new instrumentation, and lots of new stuff, more up-to-date stuff. And the document should be ready this year, and pretty soon after that, training materials on MARSOM 2, you can look forward to that if that's part of your work. Let me skip this, maybe save it for some other time. And maybe this is the last point I want to make, is that I think you all know that the expertise in radiation protection is something that's we all concerned is dwindling, and we don't have the good pipeline of a new radiation professional coming into the field, and that's been a concern. A lot of people have, raised the alarm for this, and I think part of the also people that seem to work longer, and that's going to adds to that issue because people are now not retiring early. They work later, and so those opportunities may not exist for new people in the field as such. Then when the jobs aren't there, the academic programs don't get the students. It becomes a cascading effect. So one thing that we've done at EPA, well, I haven't done it. So when I say we, it doesn't mean I, because I've only been there a year and a half. But I'm really impressed with how EPA radiation program has really embraced this and tried to deal with it. Part of it is through a really structured process of knowledge transfer. My predecessor, Mike Boyd, if you know him, he retired, and of course he works with us now as a special government employee. But before he retired, they went and staff interviewed him, basically downloaded his brain, in other words, if that's possible. We have another colleague who's retiring, actually retired already, and we went through the same process with him of downloading all of his information, institutional knowledge and technical knowledge, and through a very structured process. So that's one thing. We also promote mentorships in the organization. There's a lot of continuing education that program and management supports for the staff. And there's a study group actually that work on, there's like 30 some people that come together virtually and study for CHP certification. And I think we have maybe 3 or 4 individuals who are taking either part 1 or part 2 this year. So that's a resource, and there's a lot of training, educational resources in-house that's going on. So I'm really proud of the program that has embraced this issue and is supporting that. And we also have a lot of opportunities for mentorship, not mentorship, for internship and students. So if you know of students, there's a number of programs they can use. Some of it are paid and some of them are not paid. Short-term and up to year-long internships. And in a year and a half that I've been here, I've seen at least 5 that have come and done really good work. So that's, again, something to keep in mind if you have a student that could benefit from that. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry if I went over the time that you had for me.
Not at all. Thank you so much. This was absolutely lovely. And like, thank you for the insight. I know, like, yes, that's the point of the talk, but it's always nice to get some insight into how a government agency works, because I know that, as you said yourselves, there's doesn't seem to be a lot of public transparency within the EPA. So it always feels like, what's taking so long? Why does this take forever? It's common sense, blah blah blah. So it's nice to get some interaction from someone on the inside and say, oh, it's real people, using science, doing their jobs, working really hard to do so. Um, does anyone have any questions, comments, anything like that?
And by the way, Brianna, I'm going to share my slides. I don't know, did my computer stop sharing at some point, or was it okay till the end?
I believe it was okay till
Okay.
the end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just now I stopped your slides, Armin. So after you finished your
I see,
presentation,
okay,
so
because
you're
I
good.
saw it wasn't sharing, and I said, when did I lose it? Good. Okay. Very good. All right.
Also, there are resources in the chat. So there's the agenda for today, as well as some of the things that Armin referenced in his talk. Ken, do you have a question, comment?
Yeah, Armin, thank you. Excellent presentation there. Always been a big fan of your work. One thing I know you were just mentioning it off to the side, but I actually just wanted to echo your commentary about the confusing level of units in health physics, right? And how difficult those units are to teach people, and they really are becoming a hindrance. And I wondered, I mean, besides the whole argument about is it, effective dose or I mean, sorry, equivalent dose or dose equivalent and so forth. But it does seem like the other problem we have in the US is that we haven't adopted the SI units. And I wondered, is EPA ever taking a position on that or trying to enforce more of its, primary role in providing kind of the risk coefficients or the health effects to actually force the other agencies to adopt the SI units? Like, I'm pretty certain the NRC still requires us to record things in the traditional unit, so it's very frustrating.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ken. And it's been a kind of a passion of mine to encourage use of SI, because that's such a hindrance. And it came into play during Fukushima response too, because it was so frustrating. I made mistakes there's not a single health physicist who can say, because some people say, well, it's easy multiplication, but even the easy Rand-Sievert conversion, I've made multiple mistakes, and it's easy to make. And when you're in the heat of response, it can become embarrassing, that you made a mistake like that. So I hope that one day, I actually made presentations to national academies in different places about why we should really switch to exclusive use of SI, and it's hurting us. At CDC, we tried to use SI exclusively unless we really had to use the traditional units. And in the new document, we're using SI and EPA. That's the feeling at EPA as well. And I think when we write the new reg, if we're given the permission to go ahead and do the new reg, we'll be in SI. But we really can't control NRC. I think NRC and DOE are the big dogs at this, and I hope that they do. It was shared with me that a few years ago the issue was before the NRC commissioners, and it was like a 3-2 decision, and so it just kind of got close, but not yet. But what we could do. And especially if you're outside the government, it's easy to do, is to petition NRC to kind of do it. And then mobilize professionals to write to NRC and ask for that. But I share that concern with you. It's really a hindrance for us. And the units, yeah, absolutely. It's confusing for us, let alone our stakeholders.
Thank you.
You have a hand up?
Oh, there we go. Sorry. Thankfully that leads right into my question. You went over, Dr. Ansari, the input from the ICRP, and my question is along that vein. Has the IAEA or any of our partnerships with any other like international organizations, do they provide input or reference data for your EPA decisions in these fields to promulgate on our end? And especially since like this topic is a question mark across the entire field that everybody's kind of like narrowed in on right now.
Yeah, the excellent question. This particular issue of equivalent dose, which that ICRP report proposed, and by the way, that's, as you know, their ICRP is working on their new set of recommendations that will come out in the next few years, and they have several task forces that are picking at each issue. So it comes in piecemeal. And this piecemeal was, yeah, we're going to propose not using equivalent dose. IAEA is having a meeting this October and inviting people to come to talk specifically about that issue. So they're inviting people to go there. And their idea is to get that input and then write a tech doc document about implementation of that, possible implementation. And I know the reaction has not been positive toward that change. In fact, one of the papers that I read was from the World Nuclear Agency, WNA, about that, and they said, look, it was written very well. It was very respectful of ICRP. But said, look, for our purposes, then, the nuclear power, TNORM, what you're suggesting makes absolutely no difference, and it only creates confusion for us. So without providing any really radiation protection benefit, it just confuses things. So, and they also, in a very, very, how should say, diplomatic way, they said that chances of us implementing that in US may be slim, just like, so, but they said it in a very diplomatic way. And so that's why I said, when it gets implemented, don't know, but usually that's how it's done. I think even for radon coefficients also, when we had a divergence between UNSCARE and ICRP about what coefficient we should use for radon, IAEA convened the meeting because they wanted to know, okay, what do? We have different things coming from different places. So there is a process that these things get sort of analyzed, discussed, distilled. For us as regulating or public health agency, it's good to not to react and just wait for the process to work itself out and deal with it at that point. But be watchful and provide input, as needed. I hope I answered your question, Jake.
Yes, thank you, sir, for the insight, and thank you very much for staying up late. I understand East Coast time.
Sure.
Eric?
Hey Armin, how you doing?
Hi, Eric.
I got a quick question. A couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago or so, EPA was the driving agency to revise MARSIM. Are you familiar? Is that revision ever going to happen?
Yeah, yes. Marsum 2, revision 2 is in the final stage of editing. It went through the Scientific Advisory Board review before I joined EPA, and now it's in the final stages of technical edits. So that document will be completed this year. As far as being the publication, when it's published, it could be next year. It could be early next year. But yeah, that's it's been a long process, but it will be done
All right,
this year.
cool. Thank you.
All right. If no one has any other questions, comments, or anything for Armin, I wanted to wrap up this talk by extending once again a huge thank you for staying up so late. I know it's not easy for East Coast, West Coast times, but we really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you very
thank you
much.
again.
Right, bye-bye. Take
Bye.
care.
Thanks, Armin.
Bye.
Um, oh yeah, everyone's saying bye. That's cute. Um, so all right, on to other business. That talk was lovely. Remind people to sign up as members. Okay, so everyone should sign up as an official HPS member. Once again, it's super cheap. It's super easy. And we do love to actually have like a growing written in members list. Bridget can drop the link in the chat.